Well, during World War I, the world economy closed up again. You don't expect a world war to be associated with lots of trade among the belligerent powers. But almost as soon as the war ended, the major powers got together and decided to try to restore that open world economy that had characterized the previous 70 or so years. And they tried very hard. They had series after series of conferences and treaties, international organizations were set up, and all of the advances were very limited, and they were very fragile, and eventually their fragility and their limitations were revealed in 1929 when a recession in the United States turned into a global recession, a global depression, and the collapse of the international economic order. So we might wonder, what went wrong? Why was it that it was impossible, effectively, for the major powers to restore a system that they all agreed was good? After all, they looked back on that first era of globalization. It was a period of the most rapid economic growth in all of world history up to that date. The world economy grew more in those 75 years than it had in the previous 1,000. And so they looked upon that experience as having been positive, and yet they couldn't go back. There were several reasons why they couldn't go back. The first was economic. That is, their economies had changed. The economies of the industrial world had, in that Victorian era, in the 19th century, been characterized by small family firms, family farms, no labor movements, no labor unions, almost no labor unions. And so they were highly competitive. By the 1920s, the economies of the major industrial powers were dominated by very large corporations, big national corporations and multinational corporations, and labor unions, and farming was no longer a major activity. So in a sense, as Keynes pointed out at the time, you had gone from one kind of economy dominated by small family firms and family farms and laborers to an economy dominated by big business and big labor. And that was a very different kind of economy, doesn't run by the same rules. And as Keynes and others pointed out at the time, the attempt to run the economies of the 1920s and 30s on the patterns of the 1870s failed miserably. So there was an economic source of this failure. There was also a political source. One of the reasons that first era of globalization worked was that the major powers elites, that is the people running these countries, were able to, in a sense, fit their economies to the world economy. So if they had to impose austerity measures in order to maintain their ties with the rest of the world economy, if they had to cut back on wages, cut back on prices in order to keep their ties to the world economy, they did it. And that was feasible and tenable in the 19th century because the people who were being asked to make the sacrifices typically didn't have any political voice. Very few countries in the 19th and early 20th century were anything close to what we would consider to be democracies. In most countries, socialist parties and labor unions were extremely weak or illegal. The middle class, farmers, the working class, for all intents and purposes, played little or no political role in the political economies of the pre-World War I era. By the 1920s, that had changed completely. Labor unions were well organized. Socialist parties representing the working class were well organized. Farming parties representing farmers and the middle classes were well organized. You went from a world in which the vast majority of even the rich countries were not democratic to a world in the 20s where the vast majority of rich countries were democratic. As an example, before World War I, it was close to unthinkable in Europe for a socialist party to be in government, and many of them were illegal. By the 1920s, and over the course of the 1920s and early 1930s, in almost every country in Europe, socialist parties were in government, and in some cases, the largest parties of government. So with that political change, the ability of governments to force austerity measures on their people in order to maintain their international economic ties failed. And what happened was the more, if you will, orthodox economic designs of the era to try to deal with the Great Depression failed miserably. They were attempted, and whether it was the middle class or farmers or the working class said, we're not willing to make these sacrifices and oppose those kinds of austerity measures, either turning towards fascism, turning towards communism, or in the West, turning towards new forms of political and economic organization, the New Deal in the US, social democracy in lots of Europe. So the summary would be, in some sense, that the political economy of the major powers during that first era of globalization had changed completely by the 1920s and 30s, and attempts to reimpose the rules of the game of the 1870s on the 1920s and 30s failed. That's what not only Keynes, but many, many others realized, and that was what was in people's minds in the 1940s when they went about designing the post-World War II international economy. They remembered what had gone wrong, and they wanted to try to avoid it.